If we could, we're going to go ahead and get started. Today's topic is going to be breaking down the barrier. What can we do to change our zoning regulations to be more flexible and allow for affordable housing? We have a great panel today. DJ LeBeau is going to go through the review of who's on our panel. Then I'll give some quick ground rules. We'll let the panelists speak, and we'll take it from there.
So good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Perfect. So we're here to review the opportunities that local governments have to reduce developmental cost of housing. Many of the zoning and land development standards that local governments implement have unintended consequences of increasing costs to developers and home builders that are passed on to tenants and purchasers. Today we will hear from professionals who can give us insight on the best practices that local governments can add to their toolkit and work on one component that helps reduce the housing costs. As we listen to recommendations, please try to visualize how these changes could play out in your neighborhood. Our first speaker will be Catherine Hartley, who is the Director of Community Planning for Tyndall Oliver, a firm that advises local governments on issues such as comprehensive planning, zoning, affordable housing, impact fees, and multimodal transportation. She has 15 years of public sector planning experience, focusing her career on making traditional, walkable places legal in comprehensive plans and zoning codes. Over the last 5 years, she has turned her attention to affordable and missing middle housing, developing code hacks to allow for context-sensitive infill projects. In 2020, the Florida Planning and Zoning Association recognized her for her collaborative effort to implement inspired and innovative planning solutions and creative strategies to provide quality, affordable housing for the Addison, a mixed-use and low-income tax credit affordable housing project in Bradenton, Florida. After Ms. Hartley, we will hear from Mr. Robert J. Gray, IACP, as president of Strategic Planning Group, Inc., an economic and redevelopment planning consultancy founded in 1983. Mr. Gray has over 30 years of international consulting experience in air and seaport master planning, in growth and management comprehensive land use and fiscal planning, in development and economics feasibility, and in strategic planning. His broad range of experience ensures clients of a detailed accuracy, proven programs, and consistent professionalism. He leads a team that is known as leaders in assisting Florida governments to prepare affordable workforce housing strategies and policies. SPG has recently prepared an affordable housing linkage fee study for the city of Daytona Beach and is assisting the city in a broader analysis of its affordable and workforce needs and the strategies needed to address the housing needs in the community. SPG has conducted over 35 similar studies throughout the Southeast. Our last panelist to speak will be Jessica Gao, who is with the Cobb Cole Law Firm. Mrs. Gao was born and raised in Ocala, Florida, and attended the University of West Florida after graduating from Bellevue High School. After graduating magna cum laude and as an honors scholar with the University of West Florida, Mrs. Gao attended the Florida State University College of Law. While in law school, Mrs. Gao served as the president of the Environmental Law Society, the associate editor of the Journal of Land Use and Environmental Law, and the notes and comments editor for the Florida State University Law Review. Mrs. Gao also volunteered as a peer mentor for the law school and acted as a student ambassador throughout her time there. Mrs. Gao currently serves as the executive director for the Volusia County Association for Responsible Development, better known as VCARD, and is an appointed member of the Volusia Forever Advisory Committee, established by the Volusia County voters. Mrs. Gao is also closely involved in Homes Bring Hope, an organization dedicated to eradicating homelessness in Volusia County. along with being a member of the Florida Brownsfield Association. So before we hear from our panelists, Clay Irving from Volusia County's Growth and Resource Management will provide a quick overview of how the program will operate. Again, we all thank you for attending and participating in this critical step in our efforts to expand and improve how we are addressing housing in Volusia County. Thank you.
Thank you, DJ. Today, what we're going to be focusing on is, again, our local regulations. As we heard throughout the presentations this morning, one size does not fit all. What we have right now are 3 experts who are going to give you their recommendations on what Volusia counties and the cities within Volusia County can do. After they're through, we will take a quick survey. We've got 9 quick questions just to kind of gauge people's temperaments on some of these changes that we're talking about. Afterwards, we will have time for questions from you in the audience as well as those who are participating virtually. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and hear from Catherine.
Hi, thank you. Oops. Good afternoon, everybody. How are you? Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. So I'm a recovering planning director. I work for I work for Tyndale Oliver now as the community planning director, and I've been working on a couple of affordable housing studies, particularly right now with the Hillsborough City County Planning Commission. We're evaluating their density bonus program for their comprehensive plan. And as part of that project, we have interviewed several local governments around the state, as well as affordable housing developers, folks at the Schimberg Center for Affordable Housing, and many others. So if you have questions, you can contact me. We do have our white paper that we've written on that covers those interviews and kind of our best practices. So offline, if you want me to send you an email with that information, I'm happy to do so. But today I'm going to talk to you about what I call my top 10 code hacks and edits for pink tape. And by pink tape, I'm not just a girl. Pink tape is less red tape, right? So I'm just going to cover those couple of things with you today. And there's a little article that I wrote for the Florida Planning Magazine in front of you that covers some of those things, but because of the word limit, I couldn't really go into it today. So a couple of things that I want to cover today. The first was a code hack that I actually did as the planning director for the city of Bradenton. Our code was so, interestingly, we had 2 codes. We had a form-based code that was part of the SMART code for our CRA redevelopment areas, like the traditional parts of town. And then for the suburban parts of town, we had a typical Euclidean code. And for all of the zoning districts, we allowed ADUs, except for what was R1 in most places. That's just residential, single family, like typical 7,500-foot lots. It allowed for an accessory unit, but not an accessory dwelling. And so many local government codes will call a dwelling something that has a stove, and that's pretty much all it will say. And so 99% of the calls that I received from folks in the community that wanted to do an ADU were about my age and had an aging parent, and they wanted to move into the family, but didn't necessarily want to live in the same house. They wanted some independence, but needed to be looked over a little bit. And so, in I also had the building department under me, and we were trying to kind of figure out, we were in the middle of a code update for the Euclidean code. The ADU, allowing it everywhere, was part of that, but we had not yet reached adoption. COVID kind of slowed everything down, right? So these folks would tell me, and I coordinated with the building official and my zoning staff, and said, okay, here's what you can do. Go ahead and plumb for everything that you need, kitchen, bathroom, whatever. Just, get a really nice wet bar, right? And put the electric in for the stove, but wait until we do the code edit to drop the stove in. So put everything else that you need in there, totally legal. I will sign off on it. The building official will sign off on it. So that was my official code hack, and I was able, because I was the director, I was able to make that call. So there's your one way to do things if you want to go that far. Our other thing was basics, allow ADUs anywhere where you have mixed use, or residential. It just makes sense. Again, a lot of folks want to do it for an aging parent or a kid that has to come back home. But because housing prices are so high right now, materials are high, labor is high, it's just kind of ridiculous. People need that extra income, especially if it's just a unit that's 650 square feet or less. It's not like you're going to have a huge family moving in there. That extra income that helps towards your mortgage is a big deal. So think about that as well. Density bonuses are what a lot of folks will have as part of their comprehensive plan and their zoning code. They have to work together with other policy considerations, and parking is one of the biggest ones. So if you give a density bonus, but you still require 1 or 2 spaces per unit, and if you think about it, a standard parking space is 10 by 20, and then you have half of a drive aisle, which if you've ever worked with your fire department, it's usually bigger than it needs to be. It takes up almost as room as a 600, 700, 800 square foot apartment. You're looking at 600 square feet at least. And on top of that, if you're familiar with RS Means, it's a data center where local governments and mostly construction folks estimate what their costs are going to be, and it's very localized, and it includes labor costs. So if you look in your region to see what a parking space, just even a surface space, actually costs, it's between $5,000 and $10,000 a space, just for a surface space. And I'm sure a lot of you know how much a structured parking place goes. In Bradenton, they built a parking garage 2 years ago. It came out to $25,000 a space. That is really hard to get a return on that investment. So think about those things as well. So if you imagine adding $40,000 to someone's mortgage, that's significant. Even they might have a transit stop right outside their door, and they got to pay for that parking anyway. So it's expenses that contribute to the cost of housing. Let's see. Oh, buffering. So what a lot of cities will do, and counties in their codes, especially when you have a PD process, they assume that everything is not compatible with each other. So you will have this huge buffer that's in addition to setbacks and the other things that you require, stormwater, other open space, that kind of thing. And not only does it unnecessarily block things from connecting, I mean, it messes up your complete street network. And if you're trying to encourage connectivity, particularly for multimodal reasons, or just because your traffic is terrible because the way, traditional networks, it's a local street, collector, arterial, and everything's getting funneled onto the same street and everybody's freaking out about traffic, it really does impede your way to do connectivity. So if you're also looking at multimodal, think about that in your code and rethink those things. A lot of codes will also say, particularly for residential, you can only have one principal building per lot, whether it's a house or whatever. If you think about what missing middle housing covers these days, cottage courts are a part of that. And typically, it can be 6, 7, 8, depending on, your different access points. They're all on one lot. Sometimes they're condominiumized, sometimes they plat. It's easier if you're going to hold them for rental to just have one lot and have the different units on that and keep it. Because if you finance it through FHA, under the FHA financing, a house is 1 to 4 units. So you can get a 30-year standard mortgage with 4 units, and then you can do another 4 later. See what I'm saying? And then they turn in onto a central green, and it's really nice. So, but if your code says you can only have one principal building, then that blows your missing middle cottage court out of the water. A lot of codes, especially if they date back to the 70s, will say they'll have minimum sizes per unit. And it'll be 1,200, 1,500, 2,000 square feet. people are downsizing these days. I know that I have. And so having that minimum size, you just don't want to do that to anybody. That's housing in general, right? So just get rid of that immediately. And all these things are little incremental things that you can do. You don't have to do a wholesale, major update to your code. It's just sometimes with elected officials, you have to take things in small bites, especially if some things are controversial and others are not. So these are just little things that you can do over time. In more urbanized, and by urban I don't mean a big city, by urban I mean a traditional walkable place that still has an urban form, it's more important, the block sizes, especially for walkability. If you have more than a 600 by 600 block, that any bigger than that, that tends to really impede your connectivity. So, for instance, downtown Tampa and downtown Portland, that planners forever have been, Portland's the best. They're on a 200 by 200 grid, and Ybor City in Tampa, where I live, is on a 300 by 400 grid, and those are very walkable places. So, what's more important than the lot size is the block size. And so, does it really matter if there's a bunch of platted lots in there that are 50 by 100, or a typical, another missing middle housing type, a townhouse that I sold a few years ago that had plenty of space for 2 people and a detached garage and a nice patio. My lot was 15 feet wide. It was 15 feet by 100. It was plenty of space for me. So just kind of rethink what your minimum lot sizes are and think more about the block structure. Let's see. Garage conversions, that's a big deal too. So houses that went back to the early 1900s, especially 1920, 1930, may already have a detached garage in the back. It probably doesn't meet your 70s, 80s code for setbacks. It's not, setbacks aren't necessarily a health, safety, or welfare condition. Your fire code addresses that. Your building code addresses that. The fire separation is what's more important. So just let them convert the garage to housing. I mean, who cares? Let it be a non-conforming condition. So that's another thing that you can consider. Let's see. I think, one more thing, semantics. Again, if you are dealing with elected officials, I have found that you can't say duplex for a public hearing. Paired villas, however, seem to get through the process. So the city of Bradenton, if you proposed a duplex, forget it, denied. But when a developer came through with a paired villa, great. We had so many PDs that came through that were paired villas. Or, attached single family or townhouse if it's 3. So semantics all the way. You just have to know what your audience is. So those are my top 10 things that I just wanted to cover with y'all today. Thank you.
All right, we'll hear from Robert.
Thank you. That was very enlightening.
Paired villa, very important.
As mentioned in my intro, we are doing several affordable housing, workforce housing programs for local governments. Lately, a lot of them have been linked or associated with doing linkage fees. So if you want to get into that and question and answer, we can do that one. I handed out in their packet, this is sort of the average toolkit pack that we come up with when we do studies. I mean, I hate to say it, it's not a cookie cutter, but these are the ones that tend to be the things that local governments will select from at the end of the day. I would like to go over a couple of things that we mention an awful lot and we are not doing a lot of. We're talking about ADUs. At the national level, ADUs is the #1 solution to affordable housing, i.e. the mother with 1 kid, that type of thing, that are at the bottom of the housing chain. Lots of places have codes for ADUs. The problem seems to be working with the community banks in the process of trying to fund those and the like. That's the #1 cause of not building ADUs right now, is an understanding of what they are, what they can do in financing. So if I had to pick one, and you've heard a lot of that tonight, today, are the ADUs. The second thing I want to talk about deals a little bit with linkage fees, but it's density. And we talked about density here. And density, we approach it from a little different angle. Is how do you, prior to recent legislation at the state level, we used to sit there and say, how do you do incentives and not have them draconian concept of taking too much from the builders, because most of the programs were residentially based. They were not commercial based at all. So what we found out is that basically if you can take the land cost out of the equation, i.e. increasing another level of the FAR, you've at least equalized it to a developer. Excuse me, I'm getting over throat cancer. What we recommend usually is do a 3-for-1. One's for affordable housing, the next two are for the developer. That way, when you calculate out the entire building cycle, you're saving somewhere around 30 to 50% of the house of affordable housing costs. And I don't think we've mentioned it directly, but from the supply side, cost is the issue. I mean, we can have housing at various levels. We can argue small homes and modular homes and everything else. The bottom line is do incomes keep up with housing costs? And we all know that isn't the case. So the question is, how do you get something built? We have a lot of policies and programs out there, but I hate to say it, we don't have enough, thank you. We don't have an awful lot of actual construction in terms of the number of units. As the speaker from St. Pete was mentioned, we're not touching the bottom. And the only way we're going to do that is to build more units, and more units will lower costs. One little fact in Volusia County, from October 2000 to October 2001, multiple service listings, the price of a median house here was $299,000, the median price. It's an increase of 19.6% over 1 year. Guess what real wage income was? Minus 1.1. Even though we saw a lot in the news that we're getting more salaries and stuff, hasn't kept up with inflation. That is the crux of the problem as we're moving into the future. So the things that we tend to try to look for is how do you reduce costs? And we've hit a lot of those right now, but again, get the land out of there, whether it's a community trust is one way. I don't think it's the final way to get a lot of stuff done. But get the developer land cost out so he can write that off. Allow for different size units, if you will. I hate to say it, the rule of thumb right now, the American dream, is not the paradigm of the last 10 years, and it will not be the paradigm for the next 10 years. It's rental. We just cannot produce enough housing. And I will caveat for those that are my age, will remember when apartments got converted to condos. So just because you're doing rental doesn't mean if they're done in the right construction that they can't flip at a later date. Building fees, when I did an economic development program for you all, back almost 30 years ago, wasn't it? And one of the first things we heard about why Volusia County was not keeping up with Orange and Seminole and all that was the developer was saying, it's too hard to work here. Every community has a different set of standards, okay? So if you want to start looking at collaboration and stuff, having somewhat similar standards all the way through the development cycle will reduce costs, because a developer comes in, he's got to deal with a whole different set of standards. So again, the logic that we operate on is how do you reduce costs? Expedited permitting, I think we've talked about that. I've yet to find anybody that could quantify that.
Everybody's
I'm
different.
still going to try. Great policy, and it does save, but the thing that you may or may not know, and then I'm going to finish up real quick here, is that the state legislature last year passed a ruling that says basically you can do linkage fees, you can do all sorts of things to attract affordable housing, but you have to make the developer whole. And what does that mean? That just means if you want an affordable housing component, and that component's going to be 10 units out of 100, you can calculate what that would be if he had to supply just those units. And you have to come up with a way through the back door, in most cases, to equal that. I happen to like that idea for a couple of reasons, one of which is the problem we have is brick and mortar. The problem we have is actually getting something built. So to the fact that if we can make him whole through savings in expedited permitting, reduced permitting fees and the like, that's coming out of this pot over here, and we can later put it in, if we are smart enough to do a housing trust fund, start a pie or that can collect all the dollars for housing, because again, the end result is you have to have the dollars to promote the housing as we move forward. Anyway, Jessica.
I will nudge this over, but I think I talk loudly, so you guys can probably all hear me. Jessica Gow with Cobb Cole Law Firm. When they tell you you're going third on a panel that goes over recommendations, I will preface mine with saying that I tried to do some abstract recommendations because I knew that Catherine and Robert were going to hit on the toolbox already. So before I start, a lot of mine will tie into the concept that we've heard today about impact fee waivers, increased density, and kind of practical roadblocks where those items are fantastic, but there are other steps we can take following that make them work better. So starting with impact fees, we hear this idea that one way to incentivize affordable housing is to waive impact fees. And there are different categories, and impact fees are there to make sure that our local governments have the infrastructure that they need to support development as it comes in and run our municipal services, which we all need. Waiving those impact fees, say if you waive the county traffic impact fee for affordable housing, it's great. During our webinar, what we discussed, though, is that throughout Florida, we also have concurrency management. So that is separate from impact fees, and that's the question of whenever development comes in, you have to show that there is infrastructure there to serve the development before it starts. And if it's not, you have to review and see what improvements you need to put in place before it can come on board. So a really good example of that I'll fall back on during this discussion is for transportation concurrency, our roadway network. If those roadways are deficient, you go through what's called kind of your proportionate share to see what improvements need to be done on those roadways to make them functionable and be able to serve your development. And then you pay the cost that your contribution is towards that fix, whether it's a new turn lane or a signal or a road widening. And so when we talk about waiving impact fees for affordable housing, it's fantastic. The other side is that where you're waiving impact fees, you may still have the concurrency obligation to pay the same amount that you would pay in impact fees. And what I'll say as someone who represents developers and wants to bring projects forward, certainty and a set pro forma are guarantees to make developers happy. Even if it is a longer timeline, like we talk about expedited permitting, if you can give them a schedule and it works, even if it's 8 months, it's better than telling them it's 6 and it ends up being 12. So the guaranteed costs. So if you have impact fee waivers and you put that in your pro forma, and then you do your traffic analysis and you say, well, I was going to pay $1 million in impact fees. Those are waived because we're affordable housing, but now we have a $900,000 proportionate share for traffic concurrency. Hint, the proportionate share payments are impact fee creditable, and so generally you'd knock each other out in your pro forma. So when we waive impact fees but we don't deal with concurrency, we're kind of putting a line item back that we meant to remove. So how do we deal with that? One is finding ways to provide certainty. So there are certain local governments here in Volusia County that provide for capacity reservations of concurrency earlier on in the process. So normally we test for those at, when a site plan comes in for a commercial project and we see what uses are coming in, or when a plat comes in for a residential project and we know the number of lots. Certain local governments, I know Daytona has it in their code, allow for capacity reservation earlier on within set limits, so long as, the same actions are taken. The payment is made to increase the roadways and so on and so forth. That early reservation removes a question later on for the developers of, do the schools have capacity? Do the roadways have capacity? Are my trips going to work on this roadway? So that's something that we've seen in some codes in the local governments. That's usually an easy fix. Another one is targeting affordable housing in areas where there are concurrency exceptions. So one example, within community redevelopment areas, especially in our downtown core areas where things are more walkable, you see transportation concurrency exception areas. We call them TCEAs. We love acronyms. In that area, if you waive impact fees, you already know that there's not going to be a concurrency obligation. So you're not getting that double impact. So anywhere you can promote affordable housing in those areas and target those areas where you're truly waiving that fee overall would be really helpful. And I think we've heard this morning that those core areas, community redevelopment areas, urban cores where you have transportation, you have a variety of services, you have all the amenities that residents need, it makes sense to have residents down there, not just residents who can spend money on market rent. People from every socioeconomic background making the urban cores work. So that is one recommendation. Another practical one is we talk about reduced parking standards for affordable housing. What I would like to see is a reduced trip generation rate for affordable housing. Again, it ties into what's your impact on roadways. It's based on trip generation. You have 300 units. They assign however many trips a day from that product type. And if we had one in the code that said affordable housing would be treated as this trip generation, it's a lesser financial impact on development, and we know from empirical studies that affordable housing does create less trips than standard housing. So that is another one. On fee waivers, we have seen a few local governments in the county discuss the ability to waive building permit fees and things like that for affordable housing projects, and that's fantastic. A practical standpoint that we've seen is that those fee waivers are available at the time of building permit application. And it is nice for developers to know they are available and qualify at an earlier stage. So whether that's applying for some type of written determination of a building fee waiver at zoning or site plan level planning, so that the developers in their pro forma or even in their tax credit applications to the state and federal governments can say, we have this guaranteed local government fee waiver. Because in a lot of those situations, local government contributions give you a step up in the bidding process, the lottery system, so to speak. And if you have that contribution from the local government, even in the form of a fee waiver that counts for the review, you get that step up, so you get that in writing. If you are providing incentives through your land development code for affordable housing through funding, something that I've seen and that I think is practical, we've had some discussions about it at the local level, is when local governments provide funding for affordable housing projects to commit to, instead of a 1-year choice, commit to the 2-year term. A lot of affordable housing developers, especially those going through the tax credit cycle, know that they might not get selected the first time around. It might take 2 or 3 cycles before their project gets picked. So having that commitment from the local government on a longer term really helps them know that they have the ability to go back without going through this process over and over and over again and hoping they get picked again. And from the local government side, it's hard when a project doesn't get picked, and there are, for the county, we had 6, very well-deserving projects. There was one that was selected, and it didn't get picked. When they come back next year and you have 8, there's the question of, well, do we pick the person who we did last year so they get to go again, or do we pick one of these new projects? So the certainty that developer will have that they have your contribution for at least 2 cycles really gives them more opportunities to work. And then just to echo what Mark said earlier, in all of this, I think a coordinated approach. I'll say it's easy. No land development code is easy to navigate, is what I always say, which is why we have jobs. But you can go to the land development code and look up the process for proportionate share, look up the process for impact fee credits. Pulling into those land development codes the process for affordable housing fee waivers, and just making sure that those are all outlined and that there's a process that anyone can follow, instead of having the developer initiate the conversation and say, what can you do for us? What's the process? How do we move forward? Just having those baseline, even if it's, form agreements, form language, all of those are really helpful. So those are my hopefully a little abstract practical considerations for affordable housing changes, and I think I'm turning it back over to Clay.
All right. Well, thank y'all. Those were all great recommendations. I think all of us can take those back to our respective managers and groups and peers and see what we can do to shop those around. Before we get into the MiniMeter, there's two things. First of all, do we need a separate code for the MiniMeter, and do we have that? Is it coming up? Okay. Second of all, I got to ask the three of y'all. We've talked about affordable housing, and I'm going to call out Ms. Ruby, who's sitting in front here. She and I, prior to the session, were talking about how long of a term is affordable housing? Is 15 years sufficient? 30 years? Perpetuity? Because we, as local governments, think about it this way. Impact fee waivers means that we're not funding the source that's for our capital improvements. There's still going to be a capital demand from that project if it stops being affordable 16 years later. So how do we ensure that we're getting our return on our investment? What is the minimum time frame?
I'm not so sure it's a time frame as a concept. One thing government loves to do is give away money. Whether or not you're getting a thing for a water sewer line brought in, et cetera, we don't realize that, okay, well, fine, that water sewer line just created value to that lot and all the lots that are connecting to it. And who gets the money, the profit? The developer, not the builder. It's the developer. It's called shared equity. So one of the things that we've been arguing for a long time is, instead of the forgiveness of something after 10 years or 15 years, government should be a shared joint venture partner. And if they're putting 10% in, fine, they get 10% at the sale of the property. And that can go into a revolving account. And I think that's a win-win versus, like we were talking about, community land trust, going from renter to first ring of ownership. The problem is we want to create equity. We were always saying, oh, the equity thing. Well, if you start putting all these little conditions and everything out, at the end of the day, they're really not getting any equity. So let the market do what it is, but let government have sources of funding that may not even exist today, because we know the feds, low-income tax credit, is the amount going into that pie is decreasing. The funds are decreasing. We have to find a way to create, call it a trust fund or however you want to do it, but to have monies available, not just for brick and mortar, but it's that first month, it's a security deposit on rent. There's all sorts of things that have to be done if you really want to make a movement into the process. So I'm saying it's not years, it's how do you share the equity?
Yeah. We've done, so in the research that we were doing across the state with various local governments, everyone had different terms across the board, and a lot of them differentiated between sales and rentals. Because, in the United States, you build your wealth through your house, right? So, for instance, if Habitat for Humanity came into us, we didn't give them a lot of money. They came in and they wanted to either get a hold of a surplus lot that we had forever, or they would find a property that had liens on it because of code enforcement, and we could reduce those liens. So they didn't get a lot of money. We did give them impact fee waivers, but the land use restriction agreement that we signed with them would be, okay, if the person sells after, before the 10 years, then they pay back the impact fees, and that's fine. most affordable housing, or a great deal of it, is funded through the low-income tax credit process. When they're going through, the federal and the state part of that, it's a minimum of 10 to 15 years just on their end. So most of the time, though, they were 30 to 50 years. And so if you go to Florida Housing's website or even the Schimberg Center to find out what projects are in your local government, you pull up a spreadsheet and it'll say, this project has this many units, here's the address, and here's the expiration date. And so we had a lot of comfort, at least I did as the planning director, to know that those projects were going to be 30 to 50 years. And we didn't have a problem with that whatsoever. It was like a way less, bureaucratic thing for those folks. And those were the most units that we had built in Bradenton. We had something like over 5.5 years, over 500 units that went through on the tax credit program, and Habitat did like 8. So that's how we managed it. And again, it was through a land use restriction agreement that runs with the property. But that's how we had comfortable levels with that, for sure.
And just to add, I think, I'm a lawyer, so I think there's nothing that can't be fixed through the proper wording or
Right.
codes. You can probably respond to just about anything within the bounds of the law. And so when you look at what happens 15 years down the road when the deed restriction is gone and it switches to market rate, and we want to, guard against that. We said semantics, paired villas, but, instead of impact fee waivers, is it an impact fee reduction for affordable housing? And then when a new project comes in, it's viewed as a change of use to standard, and so they pay that gap back, so you are getting back some of those infrastructure costs through your impact fees. It's just something that comes to mind as something you could potentially do. But I do think it's a question, community land trust, we talked about over lunch. Those guarantee you the in perpetuity, which is really nice, but I think there are other ways you can handle it in the code where if you're not offsetting the entire cost, you are, bringing back some of that impact.
All right, well, what we're going to do is go ahead and jump into our MiniMeter. This is is everybody plugged in, ready to go? How do you rank the accommodating level for the city you reside in? Very accommodating, somewhat accommodating, not at all accommodating? Oh yeah, the number is 29920593. Under B, 2920593. So what we're seeing is that the cities that are represented in this building right now, we're kind of getting an idea that they're somewhat accommodating to affordable housing. Unfortunately, you see that there's a perspective that not at all accommodating. And unfortunately, there's not too many that appear to be very accommodating. Okay, should all affordable housing projects follow an expedited review through staff, planning boards, and elected officials? Wow, that was quick.
How many of y'all get SHIP funding from the state?
Right now, the city of Daytona Beach, Deltona, and Volusia County.
So you are actually required under the program to expedite permitting, but there's no definition of that, right? And so, yeah, so you have to define that yourself, what that means. But, and again, it's across the board all over the state.
All righty. So what we're seeing is that there are some folks that have some concerns, and they feel that there needs to be a better way of working through this. And others are seeing that, yes, we need to make sure we have some sort of expedited review, whatever that turns out to be. Okay. Should there be waivers to landscaping requirements for affordable housing developments? Okay, we're going to kind of call it yes, but there's not a whole lot of support to that. And I think that could be something that could be qualified. In other words, it's not all landscaping requirements, but only those. And again, that would be up for the individual community to define what those are looking at. Okay, if we could go on to the next question. Is it acceptable to replace a single-family home with a duplex? It's a real simple question.
Only if it's a paired villa.
It works every time. It does.
Okay, and as you answer this, and this may be a little bit, think about your next-door neighbor. Would you want a duplex next door to you? I don't think it's that big of a deal, but that's not necessarily my world. All righty, well, it looks like there is some acceptance of that concept here in Volusia County, right? Well, at least amongst this group that we're sampling now. Is it acceptable to replace a duplex with a fourplex? Well, what we're seeing is that that seems to be favorable as well. Not quite, there's still a few more no's on that one, but again, what we're seeing is that overall this body feels that for redevelopment purposes, the capability of increasing density, even minor increases of doubling it from 1 to 2 or 2 to 4 does not seem to be that significant of a change. Providers of affordable housing can rebuild a home, duplex, multifamily, regardless or not whether the new construction meets the minimum zoning requirements. That's what REQ stands for. Is that an agree, disagree, somewhat agree?
That's rebuild a non-conforming structure.
Yes. So in other words, I have a building that's existing. It cannot be reconstructed because it doesn't meet the setbacks, as Catherine was talking about, and Robert and Jessica were all talking about. And so therefore, if it's coming back for redevelopment or something along those lines, should we be able to allow for infill development to not have to meet the new zoning requirements? Okay. So what we're seeing is there's a sense that the zoning requirements need to be adhered to with an affordable housing redevelopment project as much as possible. Affordable housing needs to be located in close proximity to transit, employment, social services, and educational facilities. All right, so we have no opinion, and we also have a strong agreement that this is kind of a trick question. Anybody who's in affordable housing knows that that's part of the requirements for SHIP funding. So you don't qualify unless you meet all these criteria. Right. So I hate to throw the trick question at it, but it does show you what we're talking about in that the fact is that as your local governments work with the private providers, they have to go through a series of other criteria that are being provided by either the federal government or the state to ensure that we're trying to further what that level of government wants to see done. Integration of market rate and affordable units is, in a project is necessary. And unfortunately, our panelists can't see what's going on up here, so they're just, they got to rely. I could be lying to y'all right now. Okay, so what you're seeing is that everybody strongly, I would say that this group strongly agrees with that statement, and that is critical because those of us who are of a certain age remember the 1960s HUD projects where we basically funneled everybody into one big building and it became disastrous. And so the fact is if you have diversity in your housing stock, you have diversity in your culture. Thank you for participating in the poll. Why did we have this poll? Is because after today, we're going to be getting into these affinity groups, and we're going to be drilling down on these topics a heck of a lot more. There's going to be a lot more detailed discussion, and we're hoping, as Jessica and Robert and Catherine all said, coming up with that common set of rules that if you go into Port Orange, Ormond Beach, DeLand, Deltona, DeBerry, or something along those lines, there can be some commonality, there can be some consistency if those local governments choose to participate. And the whole point is to try and get a toolkit that's geared towards Volusia County. We have a lot of time, so now the fact is if y'all have any questions for the panelists, please, now your time to take advantage of it. I mean, think about it. Catherine drove over from Tampa, we got Jacksonville, everything. So right now it's the time to do it. Okay.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you all for your comments and enlightenment. I have a question that probably goes to Catherine and Robert. I live here on the beach side in Daytona Beach, and I'm sensitive to this issue. Affordable housing has been near and dear to me since the beginning of my career. However, living here on the beach side in Daytona Beach, where we're known as a special events community, as much as we may talk about trying to change that, we have not yet. I wrestle with ADUs and short-term rentals because whether or not they're permitted, short-term rentals, they happen. And in a partying town, they can be very disruptive to, I'll call it a traditional neighborhood, but quite frankly, I'm not sure that our neighborhoods on the beach side here are that traditional because we have a lot of different types of housing within them. I'm wondering if you can speak at all to how you might be able to allow ADUs, yet ensure we don't see them used in manners that are detrimental to the quality of life in a low-density, single-family, maybe not all single-family neighborhood.
Yeah, there's a couple things to address there. First of all, as you know, the Florida legislature loves to step in the way and overrule what local governments do. So unless you had a short-term rental ordinance before that law passed, however many number of years ago, there's really nothing you can do to control it. What I also found in many years of working in a local government, it's extremely hard to regulate with your code enforcement anyway.
And that's the issue.
Right.
We have the rule, but it's the enforcement that's problematic.
So if you are really looking at an ADU ordinance and you're trying to reduce that, the smaller that you make it, the less likely it's going to be for a big group of folks that are partying. So if your ADU is like a studio, it's only 600 square feet, that kind of self-regulates it out, and you have less of a worry about that. I think that's how it's worked for the couple places that I've worked.
I would agree with that.
I mean, right now, the tools available to code enforcement are very frustrating to the general residents because all a code enforcement can do is on homesteaded property is lien it. And if you don't have a property owner that's not really concerning about the lien, it doesn't give you any teeth. Also, I can tell you as someone who supervised, as Catherine has, code enforcement, trying to prove what is a family residing in a home is one of the most difficult things to do.
It's impossible.
It's impossible. Yeah.
Let me have a DNA sample. You know, can you imagine somebody walking up to you, you'd be like, no.
I want to answer it from a different angle. We're sort of new as a state into the ADUs. The West Coast, who are the party animals, have had had them for a long time, as do a lot of the resort communities have been adapting ADUs for a long, long period of time. And that just doesn't seem to be a problem. Can it happen? Yeah, but the model itself, and that's been implemented and running for 10, 15 years now in other places, don't support that. Can it happen? Yeah, but the chances, I mean, you don't throw the baby out with the, with the water.
If you're almost certain that that's what's going on, rat them out to the property appraiser, because they lose their homestead exemption for that, and that can really hit your wallet book if you're really spiteful about it. That's one way to go for it.
Yep. And I mean, when it comes down to it, it's a cost-benefit analysis that the local government has to take into effect. We know that there's a certain percentage that may be used illegally, but do we stop all the other potential beneficial uses of ADUs because of 15% that may be doing it illegally?
I had a question, actually two questions. First one for Mr. Gray and second one for Ms. Hartley. First one is, explain to me the difference between linkage fee and impact fees in comparison as it relates statutorily, the benefits and the limitations of linkage fees in comparison to impact fees. And then the second question was for Ms. Hartley regarding ADUs. And do you typically see size restrictions on minimum size of ADU and maximum size ADUs? As well as when you see new PUDs coming along, do you see a restriction of percentage of ADUs allowed in a PUD?
Yeah, let me, impact fees versus linkage fees. If I were a lawyer, and we had this case in St. Pete where we did a linkage study for them, there is a legal difference, and I don't know exactly what it is, but in principle, they're pretty much the same, and that's why the legislature, when they did their recent changes, basically says impact fee, linkage fees, or whatever have to be whole. The big difference, and we really didn't get into this, the big difference is everybody you've heard today say there's no silver bullet, okay? There's no 10 arrows that are going to solve the problem. Every place is different. We got to do something, no doubt about that one, but it's fluid. The thing about a linkage fee is that that are now being pursued is for the commercial side. And the argument, basically, the residential builders have said for years, we're not the problem. We're building the houses. It's people that can't afford to live in them. That's the problem. So a linkage fee on a commercial side is based on that philosophy. It's basically saying is that what kind of employment are you generating? And of that employment, how much of that will result in household incomes that are not affordable to market grade? I do want to make a critical component, and I think I'm preaching to the choir. A job is not household income. Okay? That the majority of homes, even though we no longer have the husband and wife and 2 kids, we still have the majority of places are at least two people in the process. So we're still having that. So when I do my studies, the problem is bad. I won't get around it, but it's not as bad as some of the literature you're reading that compares a wage, a living wage, to rent or et cetera. Because they're just, yes, we are getting a slight increase in single occupancy for apartments and the like, but there is a difference. But anyway, having said that, a linkage fee is basically ties the various land use. We usually do it by a land use analysis that says, okay, hey, if you're doing a hotel, we got a problem. Okay, they're generating a lot of employment that is at that lower hospitality level. Office usually is not a problem per se, even though they're generating some employment, assistance, et cetera, whose income may be less, but those tend to have a second wage earner that pops that back up and the like. So you have to do a linkage fee, you have to do the analysis to make it logical. It's never what can be in a maximum. I mean, every one I've ever done, and I've done now 35 of them, will show, okay, you could theoretically justify $200 a square foot. You know, it's more than, I mean, if you're doing industrial, come on, it doesn't cost you that to start with. But it always falls back down to $3 to $5, and you do that because of double counting. You know, there are a lot of other sources, and that tends to get it out of the legal realm, that it's one of many, and you're spreading the wealth in the process. I don't know if that answer.
And if I can add a little, because I think it goes back to, Mark said earlier, Mark walked with our office, you know, affordable housing should be treated like infrastructure, which is funny because that's what impact fees are for, you know, capital facilities. And so the Florida statutes has a list of acceptable capital facilities that you can have impact fees for. Affordable housing's not on there. So we have to go through kind of a more rigorous exercise where we have to meet the legal test of an exaction, you know. It sounds bad, but just an exercise.
Nexus, good old nexus.
I say, so it has to be, you know, roughly proportionate to the need, and there has to be a rational nexus between, you know, the saying I think that Robert was referring to is that houses don't create the need for houses. It's, you know, lower wages, but they all work together, and it's a debate. Right, I would say, and so, you know, there's back and forth on that. But I think that's the setup where the study comes into play, where you show that that legal burden is met because it's not treated like infrastructure under the statutes.
As far as the size of ADUs go, Florida Building Code sets the minimum size for any dwelling, and I think it's 180 square feet. Don't quote me on that. It's either 120, 180, I can't remember, but that's the minimum. That's under Florida Building Code. Across the board, all over the state, the maximum size can be anything. Some of the most common ones are 650, 700 square feet, because you are trying to keep it as accessory and not the same size as the house. Having said that, a couple of years ago, Manatee County was trying to push through an ADU ordinance, and the way they had theirs written initially, it could have been like 4 stories and 3 times the size of the house, and let me tell you how that went. Over a ton of bricks. And they had to go back to the drawing board and rethink all that. And to this day, I don't even know if they wound up passing it, maybe after I left. As far as the PUDs go, you have 2 different ways that you can approach that. A lot of ordinances for PUDs will say, well, here are the things that we can work with you and make exceptions on, and here are the things that we absolutely will not give you exceptions to. And ADUs could be one of those things. But the fail-safe way to address it is to put it in your comprehensive plan, because Florida statute is very clear that every single development order has to be consistent with your comprehensive plan. That's building permits, variances, rezonings, you name it, it has to be consistent. There's no exception, there's no variance, and that is the one way that you can assure that to be the case. It doesn't allow you flexibility, but it does give you the hammer. So 2 things to think about there.
And just to play off of Tracy's question, you know, when do you go from being an ADU to being a paired villa that's next door to Sara Lee? So it's basically, the litmus test, correct me if I'm wrong, has been size.
Sure.
So if I have a 1,200 square foot house, I have to have something that's ancillary to that. So it's typically like 50% or something along those lines. So that's what you're seeing being done as far as ADUs by right. You know, the thing that we haven't really touched on is inclusionary zoning, which also you can do inclusionary zoning, and I've seen folks say that using ADUs in those will also help address your own.
So if we're a smaller community and we wanted to try to offer SHIP funding or SHIP program, what is the best way to do that? Is it best to partner with the county that already does that, or how did the other communities in Volusia County be able to do that on their own?
A lot of people do partner up, because putting that money together does help, because you know, the smaller governments, I mean, I think the threshold now is 50,000 minimum for you to be even to be entitled for it, and that's a good sized community. But yeah, a lot of local governments will partner with the county and the housing authority and kind of pool their funds together to make that work. You just have to make sure that your local housing assistance plan sets up for that, especially with the county. So think about that when you're going through that process, but yeah.
Okay, and you had one of the Menti questions we had was, some of the criteria was a proximity to transit, jobs, social services, and what were some of the other criteria? Schools?
So for the LIHTC applications, you get what's called proximity points. And
Okay.
basically, that's how you get pushed up. And then again, there's the lottery, which you could get the most points ever and still get kicked out. But the way they score those projects is that you get different scoring. So the most you could be from transit, and not a transit line, a transit stop, and they have to have a surveyor measure it and put it in the application. 0.6 is the absolute furthest that you can be, and it goes down to I can't remember if it's 13, like a quarter mile. I can't remember the exact, but you get different sets of points that way. Depending on what the tax credit is for, whether it's for a family, which is just, normal funding, or if it's for older folks. The other ones, schools, grocery stores, pharmacy, and there's literally a list of grocery stores that qualify, Publix, Winn-Dixie, that kind of thing, so you have to look through that. Let's see, schools, libraries used to be in there, but they took it out a few years ago. A doctor's office, can't be a hospital. Can't be like a walk-in clinic. It has to be a Walgreens or a CVS. Like, it is really rigorous.
Okay.
And all of that stuff is listed in the application. It changes a little bit every year, so be sure to go to the Florida Housing Finance Corporation website when they start releasing September, October, November. I think they had just another one come out recently. So you can go in and read the applications. They'll change the criteria a little bit from year to year, but you can check that out, and it has everything listed.
Great, thank you.
He's gonna go, yeah.
John, sorry, John.
Not a problem. Several years ago, the city of Daytona Beach redid their land development code, and I went to some of the meetings, and I completely missed the idea that existing garage apartments could no longer be rented, which doesn't make any sense to me. They've been, like, my house is almost 100 years old, and my neighbor's over 100. We've been renting for 100 years, and now we can't rent. So has that ever popped up anywhere else, and does it make any sense to you all?
Yes, it has, and no, it does not. Like, how do you possibly control the tenure? How does that make sense for anybody, whether it's a rent or a sale? I don't get it, especially, as you said, rentals are going to continue to grow because not everyone's ever going to have a down payment for a house or their job or their lifestyle. They may not stay in one place, especially when you're younger. You move, like when I was younger, I moved around all over the place, and so I didn't buy for a while, but it's hard to regulate. It doesn't make any sense, at least in my opinion, and the ones, again, that try to enforce that through code enforcement, you got bigger fish to fry, honestly. So that's my opinion on it.
Yeah, this may be for Clay or Suzanne. Does Volusia County, being a charter county, afforded any opportunities or any different landscape as far as some of these minimum standards or minimum changes that need to be done?
I'm going to quickly deflect over to Mike Dyer, who's our county attorney, who's sitting right next to our county chair, who can opine as to whether or not our charter gives us the right to do so.
It's like, I don't see that microphone.
You're on, Amanda.
Repeat the question for the audience, Clay.
The question is can we amend our charter to include the fact that we have minimum standards for affordable housing throughout the cities as well as unincorporated?
Or other changes that need to be done to land development codes throughout the county?
Obviously, it's something that we would need to look at further, but in concept, I think, yes, that you could address the issue of affordable housing in your charter.
Those of you who are not aware of it, Volusia County is one of the chartered counties in the state. And as such, there are certain things that have been identified as something that's county-wide. So we have Chapter 50, which is our minimum environmental standards. All of the cities are required to either implement those ordinances or adopt their own as long as they're as strict or more strict. So what Ron is asking is, can we do a similar type of thing if we wanted to in regards to minimum standards for affordable housing codes or requirements? And the answer is maybe. How's that? Is that okay, Ron?
Have any of you had any experience in invoking House Bill 1339 to overcome a zoning thing for, let's say, an industrial property to affordable housing?
As far as I know, the city of St. Petersburg is the first one to have implemented that recently. Instead of putting it in their zoning code, they put it in what they call their housing code. So give Liz Abernathy a call with the city of St. Petersburg, and she'd happily walk you through that. I mean, that's the only one that I know of that's dealt with that so far.
Right now, from the county's perspective, we've not had any of these applications. I know we have a few of my fellow planners from the cities online, so if we could just monitor and see if anybody, if Steve Spraker, Penny Cruz, anybody from City of Daytona who may be monitoring, if you could identify if you've had that situation occur.
Hi, my question's for Catherine. What is the nature of the maximum unit size for accessory dwellings? You mentioned 600 to 700 square feet. In St. Pete, where I live, it's 750. We're lobbying for a greater minimum or greater maximum. Do you know where that comes from and why accessory dwellings need to be subservient in terms of the building form?
It's really just a community choice. There's no really right or wrong answer. I kind of feel like, in my experience, the smaller ones are more palatable and will pass easier, but really it's just a community value. There's no right or wrong answer to it.
It's a NIMBY.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I can just tell you from our experience here in Volusia County and in some of the other cities I've worked at here, when you have a 1,000 square foot house and someone puts in a 5,000 square foot garage, it gets the neighbors upset. And so it begs the question, what is the primary purpose of that property? If it's residential, I don't think there's a problem with the accessory dwelling units. It's when you start seeing that the residential becomes second to whatever purpose that building's built for, other than residential.
Thank you. If you have the same size of apartment complex, senior and mixed income, same size, I want to get back to the trip generation question. So is the parking the same regardless of whether it's a senior development or a mixed income development?
So are you asking about, you mentioned parking and trip generation. So
Well, you're saying that, parking is based on, if it's a senior housing complex, how many parking places do you need when nobody leaves the house?
Right. So
So my question is parking based the same for like a mixed income, same size unit, and a senior facility, same size unit?
I think it varies. So the standard, I'll use Daytona as an example because I know.
Yes, use Daytona for an example. Thank you.
So
Great.
Daytona residential code standard is for every residential unit, regardless of type, it's 2 parking spaces per each dwelling unit. But what their code does and what a lot of our local government codes do is allow you to submit an alternative parking study that says, here's why our development is different and here's why those needs are different. And
It's called an alternative parking
study.
study.
Yep. And you can do the same thing for trip generation. So you can have an alternative trip generation where the cars leaving the project, say, I think the Minto Margaritaville in Daytona has an alternative trip generation because they are age restricted. And so there are much
And when is
more-
that brought up?
During the site plan or,
site
plat
plan.
review process,
Right.
you'd get a transportation engineer involved to review the numbers and kind of put that together for you. But I think local governments have seen that and they've recognized that in a lot of projects.
But on the
there's-
average,
Yeah.
they use them as the same rate.
Yep.
That's ridiculous.
I just want to go off for a second on the ITE, trip generation and parking manuals. If you look at each page, like if you dig through the 3 volumes of that, like as I have done, it literally says, I mean, if you look at it, if you took statistics in grad school, which, anyway, they are not statistically relevant. There will be less than 4 studies in there, and if you look at the line, they're all over the place, and of course in grad school you're like, that makes no sense. And they will say, use these numbers with caution because the sample size is so low. I haven't looked at the most recent release of the trip generation manual. It's the what I've read so far is that it does try to take urban places into more consideration. However, you still have that statistical relevance, and all the manuals before that were very suburban oriented and may not work for you. So you always use those numbers with caution because they're basically meaningless as far as I'm concerned. So you know what your community is, and you know probably what each business is going to generate. If you follow Strong Towns or any of those other websites at all, you see, the parking apocalypse at Thanksgiving, and the parking spaces still aren't always used. And the other thing is that once you get over 3 spaces per 1,000 square feet, you have more parking than building. Does that even make sense? So you just kind of, and again, it's a community value, but the education part of that, with your local government officials or the community or your planning commission or whatever, it really is an education thing. If you have a parking problem, that's amazing. Then your city's doing well. Exactly. And if you see like all the LIHTC projects that I have seen so far, and I've always I couldn't give parking away because everyone's going to provide it anyway, but we had in our code specifically, and I was able to sign off on it, that if you were within a quarter mile of a transit stop, we could basically reduce your parking down to 0. I could never give that all away. But, even when they put the parking in, when you kind of look at it over time, they were never full, especially the senior housing ones. I mean, they're more dependent on transit, which makes sense because you don't want to spend another 20% of your income on transportation plus housing. Oh, there's a great resource. What's the name of it? For heaven's sakes. Center for Neighborhood Technology. And you can go in and see for every city or region or whatever that will say, here's the average, and they pull all this data, census data, you name it, and it'll say, here's how much a family's spending on housing, and here's what they're spending on transportation, and it goes way over 50% of your income, which is fine if you're making $200,000 or $300,000, but if you're making $40,000 or less, people start foregoing healthcare, groceries, clothing. I mean, it's a big deal, so you can kind of gauge that for yourself. And again, when a parking space can cost $10,000 a space, just a surface spot, you're blowing up costs for everybody. And even with the occlusionary zoning, being able to waive that parking and trying to make the developer whole, that money goes towards that. That's $20,000 that you can take out off the top, whether they use that incentive at all. And the city of Gainesville is actually working on that right now. So that's another resource they've been working on for about 9 months or so. So kind of take a look at what they're doing with that. I haven't followed up with it recently, but that's another great resource for that.
All right, if there's no other questions, do we have anything coming in over the radio waves? All righty. Well,
I would like to make one comment to get everybody
we
thinking.
have time that if anybody wants to make some closing comments on the
There's
panel,
a
please feel free to do so.
Map in your, having worked so often in Volusia County, the Palmetto Curtain, okay, you have at least 2 Volusia counties, west and east. The interesting thing is this 49% of the people who live in Volusia County do not work in Volusia County. So it's the chicken or the egg, and I must say it was probably the egg, that places on the west side in particular, Deltona and all those, grew because they became the bedroom community of Orlando, okay? So again, when we look at things like affordable housing and the like, I think gets more complex than a lot of people realize for the county, for Volusia County, because you've got a lot of people here that are, the statistics are buried because of the percentage. You say how many have median income less than da-da-da-da-da. Well, guess what? A lot of those bought here because it was affordable to them, but maybe at still 50%. And yet they're really working in Orlando. So who's responsible? Some thoughts.
Jessica, you got anything to, and Robert, thank you very much. That is a critical part, because if you are motoring to your job outside of the county, because we have affordable housing here, as our values go up, what's going to happen? Are we going to be forcing people further and further outside of Volusia County? And where are they going?
Well, it's interesting because the site that you just mentioned, it was done a long, long time ago, and it was very, very interesting that in most urban areas of the United States, or urbanized counties, and like, the thought was you could drive your way out of affordability. Okay? I mean, that was the rule of thumb until maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, until they started doing the analysis of what a car costs, or two costs. And as you mentioned, the general rule, believe it, for the United States, and that's, we have a lot of rural areas and everything else, it's about 35-40% is, no, I won't say it, it's 20 to 30% housing of median income, and close to the same, but just a little bit, 5% points less for car ownership. So when you add those two together, you know, you're finding a lot of communities that, hey, you're spending 50-60% or more just for housing and the car. And that's why in Todd developments, we like to say is they work because if you can reduce the parking and remove one car, not just the, you know, but remove one car from that family income, you've just made a significant impact to the affordability of the house type of deal. But you can no longer drive yourself out of affordability. That model is gone.
Very good. Thank you. Jessica, Catherine, anything y'all want to add? DJ, anything you want to add?
I'll just, a quick closing comment. I have only been in Volusia County for 3.5 years. So straight out of law school, came here, but I will hopefully live here for the rest of my life because I never want to move again. And for about 2.5 of those years, this has been a main focus of the county and the local government's affordable housing. And so I'm really excited to have gotten in on those discussions from the beginning. And I just wanted to thank the county for hosting this and keeping the conversation going, because we know it's been an issue. It's been an issue as long as I'm here and years before that. And so I'm excited to see it move forward and progress. And to do that, we have to keep talking. So.
Yeah, thank you very much for sponsoring it. I could talk for hours, so I'll let you go. If you want to talk offline, please feel free to contact me.
And I want to applaud these folks. They're doing this on their own volunteer time. They came here to help us out, so thank you all.
Thank you.
All right, so now let's go ahead. We're going to reconvene.